Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are here with more notable names in Jewish American history. Today we are looking at Saul Alinsky. It's a name you'll come across often when you deal with economic and social systems. But anyway, let's go ahead and look into this. This first part's from the Freedom from Religion Foundation. On this date in 1909, a communist organizer, Saul David Alinsky, was born in Chicago, in a Chicago slum, to Russian Jewish immigrant parents. Alinsky said in an interview that they were strict Orthodox. Their whole life revolved around work and synagogue. When asked if he was devout as a boy, he responded, "I suppose I was, until I was about 12. I was brainwashed, really hooked. But then I got afraid my folks were going to try to turn me into a rabbi, so I went through some pretty rapid withdrawal systems and kicked the habit." Alinsky majored in archaeology at the University of Chicago, but after 2 years of graduate study, he left to work as a criminologist for the state of Illinois. In the mid 1930s, he started working with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, in AFL-CIO as we know it today, and became close friend of John L. Lewis. Alinsky shifted from labor to community organizing in 1939, focusing first on improving the impoverished slums he grew up in, and in 1940, millionaire Marshall Field III provided him with the funds to start the Industrial Areas Foundation, which grew into a prominent training institute for radical community organizers across the country. Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez were connected to the IAF, along with numerous other organizers and movements. Alinsky's street-smart tactics influenced generations of community organizers, including President Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, who wrote her senior honors thesis at Wellesley College on Alinsky. The Times said Alinsky was hated and feared in high places from coast to coast for being a major force in the revolution of powerless people. His political philosophy was very nonconformist, and this carried over into his personal life. When asked if he had ever considered joining the Communist Party, he told Playboy, "Not at any time. I've never joined any organization, not even ones I've organized myself. I prize my own independence too much. And philosophy, I could never accept any rigid dogma or ideology, whether it's Christianity or Marxism. The goal of the radical," Alinsky explained in his last book, Rules for Radicals, "must be to bring about the destruction of the roots of all fears, frustrations, and insecurity of man, whether they be material or spiritual. Enemies of the poor can no longer live up to their own rules, then the Christian church can give up to Christianity." In a move that horrified the religious right, Alinsky dedicated the book to the devil, the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment, and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. His first book, published in 1946, was Reveille for Radicals. Re- I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Reveille. 3 years later, he published John L. Lewis, an unauthorized biography. Alinsky married Helene Simon, another University of Chicago student, and they adopted 2 children, Catherine and Lee David. Helen tragically drowned in 1947. He was married to Jean Graham from 1952 until their divorce in 1970. Next year, he married Irene McInnes. He died of a heart attack in 1972 at the age of 63 while walking in Carmel, California. His ashes were buried in a family plot in Chicago. On the marker is a quote from Thomas Paine that also appears in the epigraph of Rules for Radicals. Let them call me rebel and welcome. I feel no concern from it, but I should suffer the misery of devils were I to make a whore of my soul. So yeah, let's go ahead and look at Britannica here. Born January 30th, 1909 in Chicago, Illinois, and died June the 12th, 1972 in Carmel, California. He was an American social organizer who stimulated the creation of numerous activist citizen and community groups. After college training in archaeology and criminology, Alinsky worked as a criminologist in Illinois for 8 years, and in 1938 undertook his first community organizing campaign in a working class area of Chicago. The result was the Back of the Yards Council, which became a prototype for a generation of community organizations. In 1940, Alinsky founded the Industrial Areas Foundation and trained cadres of organizers in his techniques. Following wartime service in several federal agencies, Alinsky and his IAF team carried their techniques to communities throughout the country. The Community Service Organization in California provided early training for Cesar Chavez, who went on to found the United Farm Workers of America. In his hometown of Chicago, Alinsky accomplished one of his most notable successes with the Woodlawn Organization, one of the first successful efforts in the country to organize black inner-city residents. He wrote the first of his 3 books, Reveille for Radicals, 1946, while serving a term in jail. His other books were Rules for Radicals in 1971 and the biography of John L. Lewis, 1949. He continued his organizing activities up until the time of his death. And finally, let's look at the Wikipedia article on him here. Let's see. So he's educated, University of Chicago, was a community organizer, writer, political activist. Let's see. His work through the Chicago-based Industrial Areas Foundation, helping poor communities organize, to press demands upon landlords, politicians, bankers, and business leaders won him national recognition and notoriety. Responding to the impatience of a new left generation of activists in the 1960s, Alinsky in his widely cited Rules for Radicals, a pragmatic primer, defended the arts both of confrontation and compromise involved in community organizing as keys to the struggle for social justice. Beginning in the 1990s, Alinsky's reputation was revived by commentators on the political right as a source of tactical inspiration for the Republican Tea Party movement, and subsequently by virtue of indirect associations with both Clinton and Obama as an alleged source of a radical Democratic political agenda. Bullshit. Just typical bullshit. While criticized on the political left for an aversion to broad ideological goals, Alinsky has also been identified as an inspiration for the Occupy movement and campaigns for climate action. So yeah, even though he died in the 70s, he was brought up in the 90s as, oh, his influence was dangerous. Da 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 da. He was born in 1909, Chicago, Illinois, to Lithuanian Jewish immigrant parents from Vilnius, Russian Empire. He was the only surviving son of Benjamin Alinsky and his second wife, Sarah Tannenbaum Alinsky, from Vilnius, now modern-day Lithuania. His father started out as a tailor, then ran a delicatessen and a cleaning shop. Both parents were strict and observant Orthodox. Alinsky describes himself as being devout until age 12, in which he began to fear his parents would force him to become a rabbi. Although he had not personally encountered much anti-Semitism as a kid, Alinsky recalled that it was so pervasive you just accepted it as a fact of life. Called up for retaliating against some Polish boys, Alinsky acknowledged one rabbinical lesson that sank home. It's the American way, Old Testament. They beat us up, so we beat the hell out of them. That's what everybody does. The rabbi looked at him for a moment and said quietly, "You think you're a man because you do what everybody does, but I want to tell you something great. Where there are no men, be thou a man." Alinsky considered himself an agnostic, but when asked about his religion, would always say Jewish. Let's see. Overturning the propositions of a still ascendant eugenics movement, Burgess and Park argued that social disorganization, not hereditary, was the cause of disease, crime, and other characteristics of slum life. And it was Burgess and Park whom he studied at the University of Chicago Sociology Department. So yeah. And of course, this pushed him into the, ideas of left, helping people, doing things. As the passage of successive waves of immigrants through such districts had demonstrated, it is the slum area itself and not the particular group living there with which social pathologies were associated. Yet Alinsky claimed to be astounded by all horse manure sociologists were handing out about poverty in slums, playing down the suffering and deprivation, glossing over the misery and despair. I mean, Christ, I'd live in a slum. I could see through all their complacent academic jargon to the realities. So, yeah, the connection and disconnection between experience and education. The Great Depression put an end to an interest in archaeology, and after the stock market crash, all the guys who funded the field trips were being scraped off Wall Street sidewalks. While there were some cases, it was a great myth of, they were constantly jumping out of the buildings when everything crashed. There were some cases of it, but it wasn't as widespread as many people wanted to make it seem like. But yeah. Claims to have hung out with Al Capone and his mob, since he was from Chicago and everything. Alinsky took a job in the Illinois division of the state criminologist, working with juvenile delinquents and at the Joliet Correctional Center, and recalls it a dispiriting experience. If he dwelt on the contributing causes of crime, such as poor housing, racial discrimination, or unemployment, he was labeled a red. Yeah, because he's thinking these are all the things that causes people to struggle and end up doing crime, ending up in places as jail. But of course, there's this undercurrent against socialism and communism. And so, actually looking at this stuff and pointing it out, oh, you're just one of these reds. And remember, this is the 30s? So, there was not yet the experience the U.S. would have with the USSR. That wouldn't come until World War II. There was a USSR. It had come about in the late teens, early 20s. But yeah. Back of the Yards Neighborhood Council. In his free time, he had been raising funds for the International Brigade, organized by the Communist International in the Spanish Civil War, and for Southern sharecroppers, organizing for the Newspaper Guild and other fledgling unions, fighting evictions and agitating for public housing. He also began to work alongside the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, and its president, John L. Lewis. So yeah. Alinsky's idea was to apply the organizing skills he believed he had mastered to the worst slums and ghettos, so that the oppressed and exploited elements could take control of their own communities and their own destinies. Up until then, specific factories and industries had been organized for social change, but never whole communities. In the belief that his approach succeeded in these neighborhoods, it could do so anywhere. Alinsky looked to the back of the Chicago stockyards, the area made famous by Upton Sinclair's 1905 novel, The Jungle. There, with Joseph Megan, a park supervisor, Alinsky set up the back of the Yards Neighborhood Council. Working in the Archdiocese, the council succeeded in rallying a mix of otherwise mutually hostile Catholic ethnics, Irish, Poles, Lithuanians, Mexicans, Croats, as well as African Americans, to demand and win concessions from local meat packers. In January 1946, the Backyards Neighborhood Council threw its support behind the first major walkout of the United Packing House Workers, Landlords, and City Hall. This and other efforts in the city's south side to turn scattered, voiceless discontent into a united protest earned an accolade from Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson. Alinsky's aims most faithfully reflect our ideas of brotherhood, tolerance, charity, and dignity of the individual. In the founding of the Backyard Neighborhood Council, Alinsky and Megan sought to break a pattern of outside direction established by their predecessors in poor urban areas, most notably the settlement houses. The Backyard Neighborhood Council would be based on local democracy. Organizers would facilitate, but local people had to lead and participate. Residents had to control their own destiny, and in doing so, not only gain new resources, but new confidence as well. Some of Saul's real genius, according to one observer, was his intent. It was his sense of timing and understanding how others would perceive something. Saul knew that if I grabbed you by the shoulders and say, do this, do that, and the other, you're going to resent it. If you make the discovery yourself, you're going to strut because you made it. So yeah, you put that confidence, you put that strength and the want to persevere in people, because they feel like it's something they control. And eventually they do. But yeah, the Industrial Areas Foundation, 1940, with the support of the Roman Catholic Bishop Bernard James Scheil and Chicago Sun-Times publisher and department store owner Marshall Field, Alinsky founded the Industrial Areas Foundation, a national community organizing network. The mandate was to partner with religious congregations and civics organizations to build broad-based organizations that could train up local leadership and promote trust across community divides. For Alinsky, there was also a broader mission. In what 60 years later, with publication of Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, the collapse and revival of the American community would have been understood as a concern for the loss of social capital, of the organized opportunities for conviviality and deliberation that allow and encourage ordinary people to engage in the democratic process. In his own statement of purpose for the IAF, Alinsky wrote, "In our modern urban civilization, multitudes of our people have been condemned to urban anonymity, to living the kind of life where many of them neither know nor care for their neighbors. This course of urban anonymity is one of eroding destruction to the foundations of democracy. For although we profess that we are citizens of a democracy, and although We may vote once every 4 years. Millions of our people feel deep down in their hearts that there is no place for them, that they do not count. So again, trying to help the poor, the dispossessed, the struggling. Through the IAF, Alinsky spent the next 10 years repeating his organizational work, rubbing raw, as the New York Times saw it, the sores of discontent, and compelling action through agitation. From Kansas City to Detroit to the farm worker barrios of Southern California. Although Alinsky had always had rationalizations, his biographer Sanford Horwitz records that on rare occasions Alinsky would concede that not all his mentored projects were unequivocal successes. There was uncertainty about what was supposed to happen after the first 2 or 3 years when the original organizer or fundraiser left the community council on his own. Recognizing that the IAF could not be a holding for people's organizations, Alinsky thought that one solution would be for community councils under their native leadership to constitute their own intercity fundraising and mutual assistance network. In the early 1950s, Alinsky was talking about a $1 million budget to carry us over a 3-year plan of organization through the country. The usual corporate and foundation funders proved decidedly cold to the idea. Successes could also be problematic. In Chicago, the Back of the Yards Council set itself against housing integration and offered no objection to a pattern of urban renewal with which Alinsky professed himself fed up. The moving of low-income and almost without exception Negro groups and dumping them into other slums in order to build houses for middle-income whites. There being no substitute for organized power, Alinsky concluded in 1959 that what the city needed was a powerful black community organization that could bargain collectively with other organized groups and agencies, private and public. So yeah. The Woodlawn Organization, mentoring in the Woodlawn Organization. With the groundwork prepared for his deputy, Edward T. Chambers, Alinsky began mentoring the Woodlawn Organization based in the Woodlawn community area on Chicago's South Side. Like other IAF organizations, the Woodlawn Organization was a coalition of existing community entities, local block clubs, churches, and businesses. These groups paid dues, and the organization was run by an elected board. The Woodlawn Organization moved quickly to establish itself as the voice of the black neighborhood, mobilizing, developing, and bringing up new leadership. An example was Arthur M. Brazier, the first spokesman and eventual president of the organization. Starting out as a mail carrier, Brazier became a preacher in a storefront church, and then through the Woodlawn Organization emerged as a national spokesman for the Black Power movement. In 1961, to show City Hall that the Woodlawn Organization was a force to be reckoned with, Alinsky combined two elements. votes, which were the coin of the realm in Chicago politics, and fear of the black mass by busing 2,500 black resident citizens down to City Hall to register to vote. Although through the Woodlawn organization, Woodlawn residents challenged the redevelopment plans of the University of Chicago. Alinsky claimed the organization was the first community group not only to plan its own urban renewal, but even more important, to control the letting of contracts to building contractors. Alinsky found it touching to see how competing contractors suddenly discovered the principles of brotherhood and racial equality. Similar conversions were secured from employers elsewhere in the city, with mass shop-ins at department stores, tying up bank lines with people exchanging pennies for bills and vice versa, and the threat of a piss-in at Chicago International Airport. For Alinsky, the essence of successful tactics was originality. When Mayor Daley dragged his heels on building violations and health procedures, the Woodlawn organization threatened to unload 1,000 live rats on the steps of City Hall. Sort of share the rats program, a form of integration. Any tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag itself. No matter how burning the injustice and how militant your supporters, people get turned off by repetitious and conventional tactics. Your opposition also learns what to expect and how to neutralize you unless you're constantly devising new strategies. Alinsky said that he knew the day of sit-ins had ended when the executive of a military contractor showed him the blueprints for a new corporate headquarters. And here, the executive said, is your sit-in hall. You will have plenty of comfortable chairs, 2 coffee machines, and lots of magazines. You're not going to get anywhere, Alinsky concluded, unless you're constantly inventing new and better tactics that move beyond your opponent's expectations. Fight, Rochester, New York. In the 1960s, Alinsky focused through the IAF on the training of community organizers. The IAF assisted black community organizing groups in Kansas City and Buffalo, and the Community Service Organization of Mexican Americans in California, training, among others, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. In July of 1964, a race riot broke out in Rochester, New York, which Alinsky said was owned lock, stock, and barrel by Eastman Kodak, whose only contribution to race relations was the invention of color film. What the fuck? In the wake of the riots, the Rochester area churches, together with black civil rights leaders, invited Alinsky and the IAF to help the community organize. With the Reverend Franklin Florence, who had been close to Malcolm X, they established FIGHT. Freedom, integration, God, honor, today. Concluding that picketing and boycotts would not work, FIGHT began to think of some far-out tactics along the lines of our O'Hare shit-in. This included a fart-in at the Rochester Philharmonic Kodak's cultural jewel. It was a proposal Alinsky considered absurd rather than juvenile, but isn't much of life kind of a theater of the absurd. No tactic that might work was frivolous. Following a disruption of its annual stockholders' convention in April of 1967, assisted by Unitarians and others assigning FIGHT their proxy votes, Alinsky had called upon them to put your stock where your sermons are. Kodak recognized FIGHT as a broad-based community organization and committed through a recruitment and training program to black employment in June of 1967. A retired public affairs officer at Kodak later said, Alinsky and the people who exploited the situation were looking for attention, and claimed Kodak had already undertaken or was developing a lot of the programs that community activists sought. We were working on it. Sure you were. Community action in the federal war on poverty. So, yeah, as you can constantly see, it's fights for rights against poverty, against crime, against what the kinds of things that cause crime and cause the dispossession of citizens, that drive those into slums. Political contentions. Alinsky would never become a direct target of McCarthyism. He was never called before a congressional investigating committee, nor had to endure a determined press campaign to identify or exclude him as a communist fellow traveler. Alinsky liked to think this because of his toughness and the ridicule he would have heaped upon his persecutors. Herb March, the most prominent Communist Party USA member with the packing house workers in Chicago, said he would place a little more emphasis on the church influence, but also allowed that as the government undoubtedly must have had him under close surveillance, they cannot have had anything on him. Yep. Yet Alinsky was not untouched by the climate of fear, suspicion, and innuendo. Rumors of communist associations and red baiting would follow him into the 60s. And once his name was associated with the leading Democratic Party presidential contenders, would follow his legacy into the new century. For some of his anti-communist critics, Alinsky's definition of rebelle for radicals, revier, again, I'm not sure how that word's pronounced, of what it is to be a radical may have been sufficient indictment. The radical believes that all people should have a high standard of food, housing, and health. The radical places human rights far above property rights. He is for universal, free public education and recognizes this as fundamental to the democratic way of life. The radical believes completely in real equality of opportunity for all peoples, regardless of race, color, or creed. He insists on full employment for economic security, but is just as insistent that man's work should not only provide economic security, but also be such as to satisfy the creative desires within all men. Alinsky would not apologize for working with communists at a time when, in his opinion, they were doing a hell of a lot of good work in the vanguard of the labor movement and in aiding blacks and Okies and southern sharecroppers. He also said anyone who was involved in the causes of the 30s and says he didn't know any communist is either a liar or an idiot. They were all over the place fighting for the New Deal, the CIO, and so forth. So, yeah. Let's see. When talking about black power, he says, I agree with the concept. We've always called it community power, and if the community is black, it's black power. Though apparently he said, stop going around yelling black power and really go down and organize. But apparently he would have some issues here. Alinsky had a sharper response to more strident black nationalism of Maulana Karenga, mistakenly identified in news reports as a board member of the newly formed Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization. In an angry letter to the Foundation's executive director, Lucius Walker, Alinsky took exception to one of Karenga's insights that blacks are a country and if you support America, you are against my community. This Alinsky found repugnant and nauseous. He and his associates would not only plead guilty to supporting America, but would gladly admit that we love our country. Horwitz notes that in 1968, virtually no leftist dissenter, black or white, was using this kind of patriotic rhetoric. So, yeah. By 1970, he conceded publicly that all whites should get out of the black ghettos. It's a stage we have to go through. Let's see. Yeah, there's so much here. The myth of Saul Alinsky criticism. Huh. '72, 1972 Playboy interview. A bespectacled, conservatively dressed community organizer who looks like an accountant and talks like a stevedore. A figure hated and feared in high places from coast to coast and acknowledged by William F. Buckley Jr., a bitter and ideological foe, as very close to an organizational genius. So I see nothing dangerous, nothing bad. I see only someone trying to help people. Quite honestly, a lot of the same beliefs of Jesus. Help the poor, help the sick, help the downtrodden. Didn't use violence. It has been suggested that Alinsky is to community organizing as Freud is to analysis. Having written about it, philosophized about it, and provided the first set of rules, he was the first to call attention to community organizing as a distinct program with a life and literature of its own, separate from any particular cause, such as the union movement or populism. His biographer, Stanford Horwitz, credits Alinsky more than anybody for demonstrating that community organizing could be a lifelong career. Huh. Citizens UK and L'Institut Alinsky in France. Well, and of course, it was used as a boogeyman to link Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama to more radical and dangerous ideations. So yeah, looking at all this information, I'm sorry this one took a long time because there was a lot of information to parse through. But yeah, Saul Alinsky. Good to finally get a lot of the information out on who he is, who he was. yeah, they always want to attack him. Oh, he's godless, he's evil. Not from what I'm seeing. Looks like he was trying to help the average person. Those that struggle, the poor, the sick. And the fact that you want to make him this great evil kind of makes me wonder, who are you rooting for? So, yeah. But, anyway, with that said, let's go ahead and end this video here. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing. Ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting these sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.